Hi, everyone. I'm going to do something a little different today, if it's okay. Okay? So I'm going to actually talk about the violence of lifestyle and enslavement and how we see this actually on skeletal materials. But I'm hoping to do the following thing as I sort of launch into this, and hopefully some of you are game to do it. Could I ask for 3 people to come up onto the stage and do something it's a little bit different? I'm actually going to have you hold and take the seeds hand by hand and gin cotton balls. Would anybody be game to do that? Come on up. Maybe 2 other people. It's going to hurt your hands a little bit, I tell you in advance. And we're going to do it over on this table, okay? I've got another person. Good. Come on over. So the reason why I'm doing this is because what I'm actually going to show you on the skeletons is the effect essentially of repeating a process for 20 hours a day, and basically what that does to a person, how it influences the skeleton, and how we see it on the skeleton. And cotton, of course, is one of the main products which, basically sort of in an industrial sense took part in enslavement. And it's an intense process actually to take seeds out of cotton balls. Each cotton ball has about 20 to 24 or 5 seeds. Each one of them is in a bowl, which is actually quite sticky. You'll feel it when you pick it up. Okay, it's not pleasant. And it's thought that one person hand taking seeds out of cotton could actually seed about 1 pound of cotton a day, doing it for about 15 hours a day. So I thought it would be interesting for all of you to actually witness ginning cotton balls, okay? So give it a go. Tell me how you feel in a little bit. It's going to take a while, so I'm going to talk while they gin, okay? All right. Yes. Excuse me. So actually, our collection, the Morton collection, you already know a bit about. Oops, okay. And we've been talking about it over our last session, so this is the 5th and final session. And this time I actually brought the skulls of about 20 of the 50 or so enslaved people that are part of the Morton collection. And I'm not necessarily going to talk about like crunching blows to the head and those sorts of parts of violence. I'm going to talk about life pattern violence and actually how we see it on the skeletons. I'm going to do a bit of a sort of a preview of the Morton collection. For those of you who haven't been here for the previous sessions, it's kind of a good idea. How you folks doing over there? Does anybody have a seed out, by the way, yet? It's actually really tough to do. I did 1 cotton ball and I vowed that I would never do this again, actually. So Morton, as you know, was working in the 19th century. He was a racist. We've talked about this, and he actually gave a biological basis to race. He is really kind of the sort of the father of scientific racism. He did this by actually collecting amassed this large collection of crania, and then began this insidious study essentially of measuring the brain size through proxy to brain size, the inside of skull bones, and ranking the races. Something which has lasted, in a sense, really all the way through the history of physical anthropology, at least in the United States. I do always give a bit of a preamble about collections, and I talk about the various kinds of ways we deal with collections at the Penn Museum. This probably applies to all museums and all collections, but it's always worth talking about. We do, of course, constantly evaluate the history of our collections. We're constantly learning new things. We spend a lot of time with archival materials, and we spend a long time actually with the collection, so we can, in a sense, really understand them and understand the information that they're bringing to us. We, of course, then move into interpretation and scientific research, and one of my missions has always been that a collection can be great, and all of us academics can sit around and talk about these things, but really these are part of the history of humans on the planet. So it's my goal really in life to interpret these collections for the public on all the occasions I possibly can. So the crania themselves are awesome in terms of the number of them. We have a classroom which is actually lined with the Morton collection, and we of course have them in storage as well. It's hard to imagine this many crania actually sitting in museum collection shelving, and it's awesome. I mean, it's a massive collection. We do have in the museum probably something on the order of about 20,000 or so dead folks. So, yeah, and so of course, we spend a lot of time going through those processes which are associated with museum collections, as we had seen in the previous slide. We do have information actually on all of the crania. We know the collectors, we know where they came from. Sometimes we know exactly where they came from, sometimes just in general terms. And oftentimes the actual information is written on the crania. So we have that, sort of history, the physicality of the history of them on the bones themselves. Morton actually was, of course, a man of his time in the sense that, it was thought that they could measure particular criteria of living people and also too of dead people, and, make particular statements about them, mostly having to do with behavioral features. One of the things that they did at the time was actually measure the angle of the face and actually talk about face angle associated basically with intelligence. We looked more at brain size when we did the history of the collection. Probably some of you know that before there were actually techniques like fingerprinting, body measurements were actually used for individual identification. So I do know that some of my friends in the audience probably know this quite well, that through the 19th century, they would measure digits of the finger actually as individual ways of identifying people that were imprisoned, for example. So this kind of effort, is actually beyond the boundaries of just the academic part of it. Morton was very interested in brain size. We've talked about that on several occasions, and it was in that ranking system that he really probably did the most damage. Okay, I'm watching the people taking the C's out of cotton. I'm wondering how they're doing. Still okay? Yeah. You think almost finished? No. I'm sorry, I'm laughing. I did one, and it was like really, really bad. So the idea was that intelligence is the brain size is associated with intelligence, and of course, all of this has been debunked. But a lot of those tentacles, physicality of form associated with behavior, really still lingers in many insidious ways. So today what I really want to do is actually kind of give a bigger story, actually. And it's so big, in fact, that I had asked one of my graduate students now coming up on 10 years ago to actually tackle this issue with this particular collection and write what she did in her dissertation, something called an osteobiography. In a sense, giving, of course, contextual information, but also telling the story of these people as individuals. When we deal with skeletal materials, and Deb made a reference to this, we see them in lots of different levels, actually. And we can do lots of different things with them because of these many, many levels in which we can study them. And we use a variety of tools and techniques now and, hopefully illuminate, at least some part of the history of humans on the planet. We talked about paleopathology, which I will do actually today. We've done metric and non-metric analyses for population affinities. I don't know if some of you were here when we talked about ancestry and race. But I'm also going to talk about primarily what are markers of occupational stress, including a whole series of changes in the skeleton that are associated with this everyday, really sort of physical association in the lives of these people. So the crania are 50 in total that Morton had collected. The dissertation is by Emily Rentschler. And I always do the following thing, which, I wish Emily was actually on stage and not me today, because Emily's work is really mostly what I'm presenting this evening. She took it on as a task and did all the archival material, all of which I'll present here. The material actually came to the Penn Museum from a physician, as really Morton did all of the time, who was in Cuba. He removed these 50 crania from a sugarcane plantation, a farm. And you can see here a reference to negros bozales, which actually means nuzzled black people. Okay, so this was the frame or the reference basically to enslaved peoples. He didn't know the origin of these crania. He knew obviously that they were coming from Africa, but in terms of more detailed information, it wasn't forthcoming. And Emily went back and looked at all of the records in Cuba to actually amass more information. The crania are actually listed here, and also to some of Morton's notes, which were listed. And I'll do even a little bit of the demography of slavery with you too, because very particular groups of people were actually enslaved, basically, for the support, essentially, for this very intensive practice of working on these plantations. Emily also too gave us these nice tables like this one. The bulk of the collection falls between adolescence into kind of medium adult life. So the bulk of the individuals that are basically taken and then chosen as part of these plantation workers, sugarcane plantation workers, are adolescents and young adults to kind of medium-aged adults. So that, of course, makes a reference for us in understanding this, that we can very precisely age a skeleton. We can also give the sex of the individual skeletons. And that, of course, then can give us this demographic profile. I was going to actually show the video, which is underlined here, but I'm actually going to let that go because last week our graduate student actually showed it from slate.com, showing the numbers of ships that actually move between Africa and the Americas. It's awesome to watch. The PowerPoint is actually on the website for the public classroom, and you can watch it for yourself. And that interactive just sort of shook me up. I mean, the number of ships leaving and arriving in the Americas is awesome, actually, to watch. You can pause and click on each one of the dots as they move across the Atlantic and find the name of the ship. And of course, then can see at all the ports in which the ships left and the ports of entry into the Americas. The story that I'm going to tell is obviously about this particular group of slaves with 20 hours of unremitting toil, 12 in the field, and 8 indoors to boil. Okay, so this is a 20-hour workday. Or grind the cane. I'm actually going to show you some cane grinding pictures too. Believe me, few grew old, but life is cheap and sugar, sir, is gold. So you might not know this, and I certainly didn't know this until a few years ago, that sugar cane yields the greatest number of calories per acre of any crop that can be grown. So, essentially this is this crop that is, for good or bad, going to feed, give calories to huge numbers of people. So indeed, this man is correct. Sugar, sir, is gold. Okay? And I did learn a lot about sugar in the process of thinking about this topic and over the course of my time thinking about enslavement. The ships, of course, I just can't even put words to the way peoples were shipped into the Americas. Many of them, of course, died on shipboard. The particular group that we're going to look at here arrived in the Americas, and in 1832, they actually died. and we think, obviously they died, but we think that they actually died of cholera. And it is 1832, one of the largest epidemics ever recorded in humans of cholera. And chances are that that is the primary cause of death. I mean, beyond the sort of, weakening and this malnourishment that we see in the skeletons that would have actually been the thing that sort of pushed them over the precipice, okay, to the ends of their lives. We, of course, have many wonderful studies actually done in the history of slavery and enslaved peoples, including the ports of exit, the ports of entry. I wish I had all the time in the world to go over that kind of information. I really just want to understand the physicality of it. One of the things that happened in doing my research is, and these are specifically in Cuba, that the men and women were actually taken from place to place. They're chained together. But one of the things that I had noticed about the collection is that there's all kinds of changes on the base of the crania that I could never quite figure out. So today, for the first time, I tipped the crania so you could actually look at the base of the crania as well as look at some of them front on, because I always wondered essentially why we had this particular situation of these really markers actually on the base of the crania of something I couldn't quite put my finger on, but now I understand that these individuals were moved by having, essentially sort of being shackled to each other with these stiff wooden boards. And of course, this put an incredible amount of strain on the torso and into the neck. And then of course explains all of the features that we actually see on the skeletons. How are we doing with our cotton balls over there? I think I've been talking for at least 10 minutes, maybe 15 minutes, so it's not going well. They haven't gotten done a single ball yet. And here's one of the crania. The first vertebra is actually fused to the base of the cranial bone, so kind of an unusual thing to see. But there's also other changes in the condyle, the place that actually holds the base of the skull actually to the vertebral column. This is probably best understood from that particular kind of shackling. We of course have much information on how slaves were chosen, basically how they moved, essentially from a pool of people to a particular plantation. And in this particular case, we're talking about the production, essentially, of sugarcane. I don't know if any of you know in particular anything about sugarcane. I already gave you the caloric information about it, but it's a stiff, woody kind of a structure that has to be squeezed. And the juice or the liquid is actually then boiled. It produces actually kind of a slurry or a slime, which is drained off, which is molasses. And then, of course, in that boiling process, eventually the sugar actually crystallizes. This is an artificial picture actually from the internet, because in order to get that brown, sticky material to look like this, there are several other stages in the process. And something which I hadn't actually realized, part of the process is the change of the color of the sugar to this white color, which is the way typically we see it in the United States. And that's done actually with bone char. So sugar is actually not vegetarian. I didn't know that until doing some work with this. The cane itself is, of course, has to be cut, it has to be transported, and then it has to be processed. I also did, as did Emily Rentschler, Dr. Rentschler now, and she did comparative analyses to other skeletal collections. And as Dr. Thomas was talking about, and quite appropriately, one of the great studies that it's been done on enslaved people in the Americas biologically was done at the Cobb Laboratories at Howard University. It is of the New York African Burial Ground, and all of this information is online. If you are so interested in it, I'd absolutely would tell you to tap into it if you have the moments. And so I do a lot of comparative material between this and these two collections and some other collections, which I'll show you in a bit. The African Burial Ground actually has probably on the order of several thousand skeletons, about 400 of which they were able to excavate and to analyze, and with great insights actually into the process, you know, the normal patterns of life, the violence of life among enslaved people. They also found at the African Burial Ground, as we found actually in our collection, and we know that we're dealing with people coming from Africa because of some of these reasons, that a lot of cultural identity is identified physically in the bodies. And one of the things that I work in East Africa for the most part in Kenya, that we see a lot of changes, modifications essentially of the body, which are part of establishment of group identity, including changes in the dentition, sometimes removing of teeth, sometimes sharpening of teeth, or making them pointy. And so, of course, in our collection, as well as with the African Burial Ground, we do have information that actually shows that to be the case. Sugarcane, as I've already said, is processed now in big, of course, pieces of machinery that actually squeeze the juice out of the cane. These enslaved peoples would have been physically by hand squeezing the juice out of the cane. Although there are crank systems actually that allow you to do this, and they might have had access to these too by the early 18th century. And I actually did grind sugarcane in one of these wheels, these sort of pressing wheels. And I did it actually for the purposes of attempting to make the world's most perfect mojito. And it actually tasted really odd, by the way. I don't know that I would do this again. The physicality of this constant sort of repetitive kind of task, okay, produces all kinds of markers on bone. We don't normally think that this can happen, but muscle attaches to bone. It produces roughened areas. Those roughened areas, in some cases of these enslaved people, are so large that you can pick the bones up by the muscle attachment areas. They're called enthesiopathies. And I'm actually just showing some joint breakdown that we see. It's actually, this is in the elbow, as well as some of these big areas of muscle attachment. I mean, in some cases, they're massive areas of muscle attachment. So in other words, this physicality of life is, you know, sort of starkly seen in these skeletal materials. In this particular case, we're looking at particular areas that are associated with basically with flexion of the elbow and the biceps muscle. But we also have excessive development of muscles that are associated with the back of the arm, the triceps muscle. And just to give you an idea of what that would look like and what kinds of activity you'd be taking part in, I show you a person doing triceps activities in a gym. There's not a super lot of comparative material for looking at enslaved peoples. Some of the ones which were used in comparison for the African burial ground material are actually listed here. So I would say that the study itself, at least in terms of the physical remains, is not as extensive as it actually should be. This looks like a decent, sort of kind of number of skeletons, but for us in our work, we need many, many hundreds of skeletons in order to achieve our goals and understanding the pattern and structure of violence in people's lives. You can see that one of them actually comes from Philadelphia, actually at 8th and Vine, a very famous excavation and it yielding about 144 skeletons. And then you can see the African burial ground, where we've got 419 skeletons, which were actually assessed. I also have to draw your attention to Leslie Rankin Hill, probably one of the strongest, in the sense, the longest term person who's been interested in the study of plantations, especially in understanding the biology of the people. If you get a chance, absolutely go to the memorial at on Lower Manhattan on Wall Street of the African burial ground. I mean, it has a massive print, essentially, on that part of the island of Manhattan. As I said, that there are thousands of burials we know that are there. It is now, of course, underneath large structures, housing structures, walls, all kinds of things. So to get to them, they really have to be digging quite deep into the ground. You can see 25 feet or even earlier. The cemetery actually was used through the 18th, 19th, and even sometimes into the 20th century, but all of those now are buried deep in the ground of Manhattan. They've done many interesting studies, as we have, in trying to understand the affiliations of these populations to each other. And you can see here that the materials from the African burial ground in the red circles basically show identification to primarily to West African populations, but also in there you can see some affinity, some of the circles going into the South and Central African centroids, as we had talked about a bit ago. And then, of course, Europeans put in there so you can see the distance essentially between them and the populations in which they were associated in New York City. We have all kinds of evidence of stresses in life. Hypoplasias, these are lines of arrested growth in the dentition. We can see this in many of our people here that I brought today. As they were, basically young and growing dentitions, these are called lines of arrested growth. And we can also see in many of our skeletal material this evidence of cribber orbitalia. This is actually the data coming from the African burial ground, but it shows essentially the same thing as our collection shows, that life is, of course, stressful, that it has this impact over a very long term on the people. You combine that with somewhat poor nutrition, and you're talking about an especially tragic kind of a lifestyle. This is cribber orbitalia. Again, I welcome you to come forward and take a peek at it. And also to look at some of the traumatic parts on the skeleton which are associated with these strong markers of stress. I always say as well that I find the story essentially of these African peoples very empowering, in the sense that, and I think that our three standing over there can attest to, they, without these people, you can imagine that we would never have the building economy based on, the sort of the cotton, sugarcane, plantation style labor, because of course there'd be no way that actually you could support the beginning economies of the Americas without them. So I'm going to end there and we'll open up to questions, but first I want to find out what's happening with our cotton people. So 20 minutes later, anybody get done a single ball? Yeah. Okay, you got done a few, okay. So I have a friend who actually picks cotton for me in Alabama every year. So this is last year's crop. I have a new crop coming for you, so get ready. And I did one time actually do a study in trying to figure out if indeed one person can get a pound of cotton in a day. And if you actually paid those people, and then of course that cotton then became, cloth, and that cloth was made into a t-shirt, that a man's Hanes t-shirt would cost about $200. So it says it all. Anyway, I thank our participants over there. I think we have to give them a hand. And actually, if you would like to take one home, absolutely do it, okay? Because I think that there are some lessons to be learned from this. So anyway, does anybody have any questions for me? Usually you give me some great questions that I can never answer. But I smile nicely. Your microphones are actually in the aisles? Uh-oh, not a single. Actually, I have to tell you, I'm happy that we have no questions because that'll give us a longer amount of time with the panel.
The cribba orbitalia,
Yeah.
what does that look like? How does that manifest itself?
How does it?
How does it manifest itself? What does it look like?
You know what? I think I did show it, but I went too quickly. It actually is a series of like kind of puckery or pock marks actually in the eye orbits. There's a lot of debate actually about what they represent. But actually the thinking is that it is caused by nutritional anemias oftentimes. So these would be people who had a diet that was very low or lacking in iron. And the body reacts essentially by trying to produce more red blood cells. And so since skull bone is in part responsible for the production of red blood cells, that sort of hyper attempt to produce more red blood cells sometimes is visible in the top of the eye orbits. Okay? And I would absolutely tell you to come down when we break, and I'll show you some examples of that right on the table too.
Okay, but there wouldn't be any superficial evidence, like on the...
Well, you couldn't see it on like a living person, but you can, really it's only on, I'm sure there are many other manifestations actually of nutritional based stress like this, but on the bone, this is the way it actually manifests. All right, you can take, should we break? Actually, that'd be great. Anybody wants to come forward or pick more cotton, I'm happy to have you do this. I mean, like, I don't know if you want to give it a try. And then we take a break after that, Kate, is that correct? And then come back in the panel.